Why are labor unions in the US so weak today? This is a question I've been trying to answer for the past 8 months or so, and I've found that it does not have an easy answer. So, to help me with this question, I have decided to reach out to historians, labor leaders, union members, and try to figure out where unions are now in America, where they were previously, and where we can maybe take them in the future to help working conditions for all people be better. To kind of start off this conversation, I started talking to Tracy K'Meyer of University of Louisville's history department, and she focuses on 20th century history. So really, for this conversation, we just talked about labor history from the beginning of the 20th century to the end of the 20th century. And so it's obviously a wide-ranging topic and a wide range of years. But I really think we talk about some important things that you may not know about labor history and why work is the way it is in America today. So I just want to extend a big thank you to Tracy for talking with me about this. I've linked her U of L page in the description. So if you want to go learn more about her or any of her work, she has multiple books I highly recommend checking out. Please go do so there. So without further ado, here is the conversation with me and Tracy on 20th century labor history in America. Enjoy. Something I've been researching and looking into for the past, I would say a good 6 months or so, especially with the rise of a lot of the labor unions around like Starbucks and whatnot, and trying to really understand why, because I would always hear the unions that we have now, even though it is a great moment for unions right now, it's still kind of the lowest point that America has been in with union participation and whatnot, especially concerning like, between like World War I, World War II, we're kind of at that dip between both of those points. And so I'm just trying to get to kind of the endpoint of how did we get here? Like what brought us to this point? And then also as like a little kind of aside, how might we get out of this point? How might we strengthen unions further? So with that, I just wanted to start and kind of ask, just what do you think were the biggest changes with concerning labor in the 20th century?
Well, the major thing was the Great Depression and the New Deal changing the environment completely. If you want to look more into this, by the way, there's a great book by author named Liz Cohen called Making a New Deal, where she very carefully looks at the 1920s and the 1930s, and it would be great background for you. But basically what happens during that time period is because of the national economic crash, it basically does two things. It weakens the anti-union popular and political bias, right? Which had been very predominant in the 1920s. It basically proved, so because in the 1920s, there was this philosophy called welfare capitalism that said that people didn't need unions because the businesses would take care of them. And Ford sort of tried to model this by paying its workers more. Ford's philosophy was that the company's workers should be able to afford the cars, right? So Ford sort of modeled this idea that, we'll pay you enough, we'll do Christmas bonuses, we'll have baseball leagues. Basically, we'll create a world where the business will take care of you. And the other thing that was really dominant in the 1920s is among, many industrial workers at that time would have been second generation immigrants, right? Eastern European, Southern European, that immigrant wave from just before the war. And many of them sort of looked to their churches, their community organizations, their ethnic organizations to take care of them. So in the 1920s, there was this idea you didn't need unions because you had these two social safety nets in welfare capitalism and in ethnic organizations. Both of those go away in the 1930s. First, the businesses, of course, obviously do not take care of their workers at the time of downturn, with mass cutting of wages, cutting of hours, firing people altogether. So the whole sort of faith in welfare capitalism goes away. And the ethnic organizations and the churches just don't have the resources to take care of people. There's just not enough resources and there's too much demand. So it kind of leaves this gap of, well, then who's going to take care of you? And so you start to get on the part of the workers themselves, people turning towards, huge wave of strikes, 1929, another huge wave of strikes, 1934. They don't go away. There's another huge wave in 1936. So the workers themselves are turning to unions more and more. But there's also a political shift. So in 1932, those elections bring into Congress and obviously into the presidency more what today we would call liberals, but they weren't calling themselves that yet. They would have called themselves progressives still, from the progressive movement, including FDR. And so what happens is you get then sort of a climate in which pro-labor legislation can pass. The first go round on that, the National Industrial Relations Act, doesn't really work very well. After the sort of re-election, after the 34 elections, you get even more liberals in office, and now people are starting to use the word. And you get the Wagner Act, National Labor Relations Act, which gives people the right to be in a union of their choice, which was the key phrase. And creates the National Labor Relations Board that actually starts to enforce that. Of course, the next year you get the Fair Labor Standards Act, which provides some labor protections. But so I think that's step one, right? You get the New Deal that creates this environment for legislation. The propaganda campaign by unions after that was the president wants you to join a union, because Roosevelt has this quote where he basically says, if I were a worker, I would join a union. And that creates the sort of legislative framework that protects union rights. The second piece of that is World War II, when the factories just needed workers like crazy. There was the opportunity for full-time work, overtime work. It was a situation of what historians call overemployment. And employers needed to not only recruit workers, but to keep them there, to prevent turnover. And part of that was a partnership then that was forged between labor and business and government and the military, because they had this shared interest in production. And so that's where you get it's the no strike pledge. I mean, the unions pledge not to strike in exchange for protection of union rights. And at that point, union membership just exploded. That was certainly during the war and the next 10 years up to about the mid 50s is the high point for American labor in terms of strength and numbers.
And so kind of going off of that, I guess, so since that, you saw that huge explosion of labor towards the end, and there's that I always see the graph that everyone uses of like the huge explosion, then dip after World War I, and then a huge explosion again during World War II, and then this gradual decline. What do you think brought us to that kind of gradual decline that happened after World War II? Because obviously there was the highest union membership we've ever seen at that point. And then from there, it just kind of trickled down and down and down until we're at the point where we're at now. So what do you think really caused us to get there?
Well, there's, again, a couple waves. The first thing is the Cold War and anti-communism, which conservatives used to sort of weaponize that against unions, passing union restrictions as early as 1946 with the Taft-Hartley Act. Although I could say that, yes, that passes, but unions remain strong for a while after that. Right. But there is a sort of demonization of unions. One of the things that happens is the sort of bureaucratization of them, that partnership with the Democratic Party, and first in the person of FDR, but then after that. So they kind of tied their fortunes to the liberal Democratic Party. But sort of in exchange for that, like during the Cold War, unions kicked out many of their most militant members, right? Right. Trying to defend themselves against accusations of communism, unions like civil rights organizations, the NAACP did the same thing, sort of kicked out its most militant members in the effort to say, look, we're not communist, right? And that, does take away a lot of the most, the leadership that was most active and ardent. So that's one thing that happens. You also have, after the war, sort of a generation of men, sort of one generation younger, who come into the workplace not having to work for these benefits that that were negotiated during the war. So after the war, you go into a factory job and you have a pension, and you have workman's compensation, and you have a paid vacation, and you have health insurance, right? These are benefits that were negotiated by unions during the war. People coming into the workplace after the war don't have to work for them. Those are there. Those are, so they're coming into a situation where they didn't experience the fight. And they are discouraged from being militant because of the anti-communist environment. And now that doesn't say that still the numbers are there. There's, a lot of these are closed shops. So that means, it's, you take the job, you're in the union.
Right.
And this is heavily focused on industrial workplaces, which is going to be important in a minute, right, where much of this activity is in industrial workplaces. So even though, if you look at the 1960s, union membership is still fairly high. Unions are still taking positions on things, but you don't have the sort of militancy that you would have seen in the 1940s even, right?
Right.
Certainly not in the 1930s. The next big blow is the beginning of deindustrialization. As as factories move overseas, move to the South, close altogether. So this is 60s, 70s, up into the 80s. Mm-hmm. The industrial workforce shrinks, right? And that's where most union activity had been. There really had not been a lot of effort to unionize non-industrial workplaces. There were some professional unions, teachers, nurses, that sort of thing. But big difference, those are female, right?
Right.
So there hadn't been a lot of effort to really engage women workers, non-industrial workers, service workers. So as the number of industrial workers declines, so does the number of union members.
Right.
Right. And it also creates an economic environment. And this, I think, is a really important switch, because this is where the political attack against unions really picks up. The economic environment of the 1970s going into the 1980s is such that businesses have an upper hand. They can basically say, break the union or we'll move to Mexico. Right. And they do, right? In large numbers, not just Mexico. I use that as an example, but right. There's other places too, right?
Yes.
And that we also have sort of the rightward shift in politics, more state governments, more federal government legislation and actions, open right to work laws. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Spreading, demonization of labor unions, getting blamed for, political blame during the deindustrialization period. There was a lot of sort of conservative right-wing political blame towards environmental laws and unions, that we wouldn't be having these economic problems without unions and environmental legislation. So that kind of gets us into the 1980s and Reagan's real attack on unionized labor.
Yeah, and then the obviously one of the more interesting things I read was how the FAA union, or the FAA
air traffic controllers.
Yes, air traffic controllers. Thank you. The ATF union endorsed Reagan, just thinking, hey, we might get a better shot with this guy, because also he was obviously the head of SAG-AFTRA previously, right. And so they went, well, he was a union guy, originally he was a Republican, but he's a union guy, and then obviously he gets in, and it's just Bad bet.
Yeah.
But it's
I mean,
again,
in his politics, they completely changed from the time he was a young
right,
actor.
right.
Yeah.
And it's just, it's hard because it's like you can't blame anybody because again, they weren't getting the best deal under Carter, so they go, okay, we might go with a different guy, and then so
Mhm.
I thought that was very interesting. Also reading that because it's just I don't know, that's nothing. A lot of and this kind of touches on a lot of the other things I will say is just a lot of this you don't hear about, like all the rights that we won as workers won for us.
Right.
Yeah, like there's this one book I've been meaning to read where it's brought brought to you by the workers of the weekend, where it's
Right.
it is all these rights that we don't even think about today, like the
There
8-hour
used to
workday.
be a great Yeah, there used to be a great commercial that the AFL-CIO ran on Labor Day weekend, which was just a blank screen with words showing up, which was, overtime pay, paid vacation, pensions, and then it all said brought to you by the men and women of the AFL-CIO at the end. And I
That
loved that. I was like, they should run that all the time.
Yes, they should continue running that today. I think it would resonate a lot today too. Yeah.
Mhm.
And then, yeah, you kind of touched on the bureaucracy as well, that this greater bureaucracy that developed under with this attachment to the Democratic Party at large, and then kind of the continuation of that. And please, you don't have to if you can't, but like, can you kind of go maybe a little bit more into that by chance?
Yeah. Yeah. So the New Deal created, during the New Deal, the Wagner Act created the National Labor Relations Board. And one of the kind of ways that historians have looked at the New Deal is it creates these agencies whose job it is to sort of mediate between conflicting interests in society, right? And so in this case, it's labor, capital, try to mediate. So the National Labor Relations Board's job it is to moderate labor conflict, to make sure that that union elections are fair, to make sure that workers' rights during the elections are not violated, to try to mediate conflicts, that arise. So it kind of creates a bureaucratic system for addressing conflict between labor and capital that would have just been done on the shop floor through strikes before. Right. So it creates kind of the core of the system. During World War II, that's expanded because, again, the interest of everybody was to ensure smooth production. That was the way we were going to win the war. It is the way we won the war. We won the war because we were able to produce so much stuff. Right.
Yes. Yeah.
That's, so everybody's interest was in creating a sort of a smooth relationship during the war. So there was actually, and unfortunately I don't remember the name of it, but there was another committee formed during the war that sort of took on that role for the duration, which was to mediate any conflicts, to address any conflicts before they could lead to strikes, to order cooling down periods if a strike did happen. There were a lot of strikes during the war. There was actually a lot of wildcat strikes and a lot of what they called hate strikes during the war. And so, again, there was this sort of government commission created to react to those. And again, that sort of solidifies the idea that rather than striking, that there is a mediation process that involves government, right? Now, when I say wedded to the Democratic Party, because all this was passed by Roosevelt, by Democratic congressmen who and the CIO, which was separate at the time, right? It was still separate, AFL and CIO. Which the CIO had a very conscious sort of electoral strategy towards achieving labor rights. They began in really even before this, but 1946 was a big one, where they concentrated on recruiting candidates for office, investigating candidates, endorsing candidates, campaigning, and really sort of saw political activity as a way to protect union rights going forward. Well, most of that activity, of course, is in favor of Democratic candidates, right? And so you get this kind of relationship that forms between at least the sort of official level of the unions and the Democratic Party. And that persists. So unions become a major constituency within the Democratic Party really until the 1970s. And they start to waver after 72. A lot of that is around sort of white working class opposition to affirmative action, abortion, the women's movement, things that don't have anything to do with labor issues. Right?
Okay, more cultural issues. Yes.
Yeah,
Okay.
or
Okay.
cultural issues. Right. Yeah. So, but between 1935, when the legislation starts to pass, and 1972, labor becomes a reliable constituency in the Democratic Party, one of the main constituencies in the Democratic Party. And I would argue that part of the reason that's a problem is that with the rise of the new right, and when the Democratic Party starts to falter in elections, then the labor loses its best friend, basically. Right. And even though many of the rank and file white members are voting, upset about the cultural issues, and they'd be voting for Republicans because of the cultural issues, they're not finding a friend in that party on labor issues, and leaves them without a friend on labor issues. Right.
Yeah, and I've heard that echoed from some other people, just saying that basically labor became part of the Democratic Party, but by doing so, it became just one of their other blocks. We had various blocks, black minorities or whatnot, and then when it became I wouldn't say untenable, but just once it become inconvenient to hold them on there, keep them satisfied, then it was like, okay, well, we'll just cut them off.
Yeah, but I think that overstates. That puts it in terms of like the Democrats stopped caring and wrote them off.
Right.
I think that what happens is that there are other constituencies in the Democratic Party that had largely been ignored. Right. I mean, African Americans have been taken for granted. Women, weren't even courted. I mean, like, it wasn't even an issue. Nobody cared about the women's vote.
Yeah.
And actually, I was just reading a really great book on the 1972 election and how important that election is here, because, because one of the things that I think doesn't get recognized is that McGovern actually did jettison a lot of the demands of the women's groups and the gay groups and the black groups and the other minority groups in order to try to keep labor. But labor, white working class, white labor.
Yeah.
One, it's already shrinking because of deindustrialization,
right.
and its power is shrinking as a result. But also, those rank and file members are leaving, right? One of the things that I discovered in my own work here in Louisville, I was writing about school desegregation in Louisville, and one of the main opponents to busing for integration were majority white unions. I mean, they're the ones that were literally in the streets, trying to stop the buses, organizing against the buses. And that's not because the Democrats kicked them out. That's because they didn't want their kids bused, right?
Right.
Or no, more often they didn't want black kids bused in to their school.
Right.
That was because that's what was happening. Their kids weren't being bused out, but black kids were being bused in.
Gotcha.
Right. Yeah. And so, I don't want to. I think there is a tendency to sort of have this top-down look at this story that, that somebody in the Democratic Party decided they weren't worth it anymore and, ignored them. But that's not really what's happening.
Right.
It's much more complicated than that.
Well, and I think it also, or at least how I've seen it, again, I'm a very elementary view of it. But as far as I've seen it so far, it does seem it is a mixture, obviously, of many things. And one of which, and we can kind of touch on this, with the thing I always hear brought up is the Taft-Hartley Act, just because it does seem like that it wasn't a huge blow at the time. It does seem like there were union leaders who knew, hey, this is not good for us, but then just kind of at a certain point had to accept it. Because again, I mean, it literally was vetoed by Truman, I believe, and then then still passed with 2/3 majority. So can you kind of talk on that and how that affected unions? Because I do think that played a big role, again, in that kind of degradation. Obviously, we talked about kind of the, not demilitarization, but obviously the most militarized members kind of getting kicked out through the anti-communist pledge and whatnot. Can you talk a little bit about kind of Taft-Hartley and how that affected unions specifically?
Yeah, and there's a political side to this too. But so when it passes, obviously, yes, Truman, campaigns against it, vetoes it. His veto is overridden. That is, before I get into the actual impact on the unions, that is one of the other steps in cementing unions to the Democratic Party, because unions come out for Truman. African American voters and union voters helped Truman get reelected.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, nobody expected him to win that 1948 race, right? But after he vetoed Taft-Hartley, and then he also did some things related to civil rights with creating this Presidential Commission on Civil Rights, that gives him those two constituencies during that election. So that is another step in that, that marriage, so to
right.
speak.
Yes.
Right?
Yeah.
Okay. So just to get that out of the way. So I think that what happens with Taft-Hartley is it does a couple of things. The best way to describe it overall is chilling atmosphere, I think, right? It signals federal hostility. It signals you better take a close look at yourself. You have to, sign loyalty pledges. You have to have cooling off period for strikes. It kind of create a pall sort of on the idea of militancy. And, so I do think it's a cumulative over time sort of, it's not like you can point to, okay, this passed and then these three unions lost members, or these three unions, whatever, right? You can't make that direct connection, but you can talk about it as being sort of first blow in what I think of as the Cold War era shift in climate to creating not just legislative hostility, but that translates into public hostility, right? And one of the things that's always been really interesting in the union story is where public opinion is on unions. Are they heroes or are they villains, right? And I think that this is sort of step one in a process that created this environment that says, you better not be too militant. If you try to strike, we're going to say, no, you have to wait. Which at that point, what's the point of striking if you have to?
Right. Yeah. It's
right. It kind of says, what's the point?
Yeah.
And sort of forces unions then into a more of a negotiating rather than taking action position. And again, I think it influences that next generation of, and I'm going to say men here because it is mostly men we're talking about, that next generation of men who come into a very different environment of union, what it means to be in a union.
Right.
It's what it means to be in a union is not fighting for your right to be in a union, but having somebody out there negotiate your benefits for you.
Right.
Right.
Yeah. And I have heard, and it seems like that has continued to today with I have a friend in the UAW, and it seems very similar where it's like, I'm happy to be in a union, but it is the management or something along those lines. It is always somebody higher up. Yeah.
So there's an interesting period that I don't know if you've come into this readings kind of stuff yet, but sort of in the late 60s, there was this effort to kind of energize and radicalize unions, very grassroots, bottom up kind of thing. And a lot of that was aimed at the idea that the union leadership had become too bureaucratic and too distant from the worker. So there is a sort of a movement of sort of left-wing young people that move into and try to radicalize unions. There's a guy named Jefferson Coey has written about this, and he's got a book on the 1970s. It's a really interesting book because it combines popular culture and politics and labor, and that's this really interesting way. But his sections on labor really are good on that period. That sort of effort to work within industrial type workplaces, or what we would think of as more sort of industrial, like General Electric and Ford and people like that, to try to sort of radicalize the grassroots base from within.
Okay.
And I think that's a step in the way towards labor moving towards kind of moving to trying to organize outside of industrial workplaces more.
Okay. Okay.
Textile industry. A lot of it was in the textile industry.
Oh, okay.
So
That's very
Norma
interesting,
Ray,
because that's
right?
also kind of the origin of a lot of like unions as well, as
Yeah,
the textile industry.
right,
Okay.
right.
I'll check
Yeah,
that out. Yeah.
yeah,
And that's
yeah,
one that's been I don't know, I've been finding it a little hard. I will definitely check out that book you mentioned about the like kind of 30s and 40s. Because I
yeah.
found it a little hard to find just dedicated literature on those periods. I find a lot on 19th century labor because there's so much there, right, to unpack.
Right.
But I feel like 20th century, I find a lot on like the 70s and whatnot, but non-dedicated just to kind of that intermediary period.
Yeah. So the two that so I'll recognize a couple. So Liz Cohen's Making a New Deal is just a fabulous book. I
Okay.
use it all the time. I think I basically just give her stuff as my lectures at this point. There's one right after the war, Bob Korstad. Civil Rights Unionism is in the title, but
Okay.
I can't remember the exact
Don't need
title.
the perfect title. But
Yeah.
thank you. Yeah.
Nelson Lichtenstein is another one, same time period. He's written a lot about the impact of World War II.
Okay. Okay.
And in fact, he wrote a great article that sort of gets it nice and short on the impact of World War II on labor. And then, like I said, Jefferson Coe on the 70s he's also just such a great writer.
Mm-hmm.
So
okay, perfect. Okay, yeah, I will check those out. Yeah, thank you. And so kind of going back to a little bit earlier in the period.
Sure.
And I know we talked about obviously the communists being expelled after World War II, but similarly with the Espionage Act in World War I,
right.
It's almost parallel. Almost 20 years exactly of just okay. We're kicking all these people out, and then again, 20 years later, we're kicking all these people out, and again, they're the most militant, most either
right.
radical or whatnot. So, can you kind of go into that and how that happened, and how it kind of parallels with kind of World War II and what happened then?
Yeah. So World War I is less my expertise than World War II.
Yes. Yeah.
By saying that. But what happens again in World War I is, again, similarly, you need a lot of stuff, right? And you need it quickly because our military was woefully underprepared. Right. We basically didn't have much of a military. Mm-hmm. I mean, so there really needed to be like fast tracking, right? And so same thing, you get some National War Labor Board, you get some temporary protections for labor during the war. You get a big increase in the number of people in the workplace. And the way the Espionage Act worked, I would say the particular thing during World War I is that it targeted particularly radical unions. So the IWW, right, was really the target there. The CIO didn't exist yet, and the AFL was not really a particular target of mainly it wasn't much of a. I mean, it was much smaller, much less organized.
Right. Yes.
So it wasn't really as much of a factor. But the International Workers of the World was really targeted very much by, and then more socialist sort of political organizations of workers as well. So it doesn't, quote, wipe out the IWW, that technically still exists. Mm-hmm. But between the Espionage Act during the war and the Red Scare after, it's kind of, for lack of a better phrase, beaten into submission, essentially.
Right.
And I think that what happens during the war is you do get this climate of, unionism is communism, is Bolshevism, mm-hmm. Which really just chills that. And immediately after the war, as soon as the war ends, we have an economic crisis, high unemployment, massive unemployment, actually, for about 2 years. And that also basically erases the gains that were made during the war. And I actually think that that's one of the things that a lot of groups, African Americans, went through sort of a similar experience of getting sort of their hopes up by World War I, right? Having them dashed and saying in World War II, we're not going to let that happen again.
Yeah.
Well, I think in some way the unions are the same way, right? We saw what happened in World War I, and after we're going to, create this partnership that's harder to break.
Right. Right.
Yeah. And plus, there's the legislative framework by World War II. So
yes, correct. Yes, yeah. I also wanted to ask, because what I've been looking through in my research, it seems like they're constantly, from even the late 1700s to now, there always seems to be the problem of obviously division within labor, between, whether it's race, gender, skilled or unskilled. Can you talk about like how that kind of interacted with the labor movement in kind of the pre-World War II and post-World War II era?
Yeah, and I think you're right. I think it's a constant issue because when you look at labor organizing, in the immediate pre-World War I and the World War I period, the division was immigrant-led or not, right?
Right.
Is this to what role do immigrants play here? And then there's always the racial divisions. African Americans weren't even allowed in AFL unions. What's interesting is the CIO, from its creation, its goal is racial unity, right? So we're going to be an interracial union, have interracial leadership, because we want as many members as we can get. That's basically what it's about, right? And to try to not allow the race baiting to weaken them.
Okay.
So there were efforts like that. Like I said, women were always in auxiliary units or off in their own union somewhere. Mostly the labor they did was mostly not considered serious real labor anyway. And so they're mostly ignored except by themselves. And I think that, there is that brief period after World War II of strength, and some of that is the sort of assimilation of the immigrants by that point. So, doesn't matter if you've got an Eastern European last name or not, you're still a laborer, you're still in the union. That brief period, and this is in the Korstad book, this is what the Korstad book is about, of sort of interracialism seen as a strength in unions. And he would argue that that's one of the reasons why unions are so strong during that period. Right. You have other divisions, I think, also sort of ideological divisions between those who, favor more militancy versus those who favor a sort of and a broader structural change kind of approach versus those who would argue for a sort of just really strictly bread and butter type approach. So I'm not exactly sure what else is that answering your question?
Yeah, no, I think that fairly answered my question. Yeah.
Okay.
Well,
yeah.
And I also had, I also was wondering about, looking again, I'm a little bit more familiar with the kind of 19th century labor history. And it seems, and one of the kind of questions I'm trying to tackle is, why was there so much violence in the American labor movement as opposed to the European labor movement? And some of it seems like it was definitely like the militarization after after the Civil War. It seemed like a lot of it started popping up after that. But I was wondering, and I'm genuinely curious about this, was there any real violence kind of, again, before World War II or after World War II? Because it does seem to really extend from kind of the end of the Civil War to maybe the 1920s. And I haven't really seen a lot after that. But again, I this is more my ignorance than it not existing.
Right.
So, yeah.
Well, and there's two different kinds of violence to talk about here. Because I think what is very present, especially in the 1930s, and even into the 40s in different industries, is violence against unions, right? The St. What day is that? The Mother's Day Massacre? Dearborn, Michigan.
Okay.
Big strike in Dearborn, Michigan. People are, shot at, fired at. There's, so there was, prevalent use of violence against strikers, against unions, in the auto industry, yes, but certainly in the textile industry and a lot in the mining industry out west, where there was, and actually the mining industry in Appalachia was also, the coal mining wars of the they've got, so there's violence against them, and everybody knows about the violence in like Matewan and places like that in the 1930s, right? But late 50s, early 60s, there's another round of quote coal mining wars, right, in Harland, where there's massive violence being used against strikers. So I think that, like, again, that's one kind of violence that is very, there's a lot of it in the 30s. It's still there in the 40s and 50s, especially in some areas. And then a sort of resurgence of it again in the early 60s in Appalachia. Now, in terms of the other side, which is, strikers using violence, there is picket line violence, right? There is people who try to prevent others from crossing the picket line using physical, fisticuffs or whatever. That goes, there's strikes here in Louisville in the 1980s where that's true, right?
Right.
So I think that that's kind of there. To some extent, that's a reaction against violence against them, but not to completely let them off the hook. I also think it is part of, I hate to say this, but there's a certain amount of kind of American culture that talks about defending your space. And the picket line, the workplace is seen as my place, my space. I'm going to defend it against people coming in, scabs or replacement workers, shall we say?
Yes, yeah.
But I think in American culture, there's a certain amount of valuing of that idea, right?
Right.
Which kind of says, okay, that's not really a bad kind of violence because you're holding your own ground or you're standing your ground. It gets characterized as bad violence by anti-union propaganda that says, see, they're the violent ones. Right. When there's violence on both sides.
Yes, when it's equally or even unequally violent from the state side against the unions. Yeah, and
it's like the thing with people calling civil rights activists violent, right?
Yes,
it's sitting on a pick, and
it's violent against what other violence, Yes, it is not throwing the other side in. Yes, yeah, and that's been very interesting, and I will look more into that because one of the things that really got me interested in this whole in this movement and whatnot was Harland County USA, the documentary. I went to NKU for broadcasting school, and we watched that, and it was very powerful, but it also was very, because it ends with them, not really getting what they wanted. And it's very just interesting and disheartening. And so then that kind of got me interested in this, and you see that story kind of told over and over and over again. And even when they do get what they want, again, it is always degraded at. So, kind of with that, and this will be my last question. What do you think could be taken from the 20th century and kind of brought into, and I know you've touched on this a little bit, but what tactics do you believe that could be kind of brought back into modern day? Because obviously we don't have industrialization anymore. It's more a lot of the places that are organizing are service industries or janitors or whatnot. So how do you think we could bring those tactics in today or at least learn from that history?
Yeah. So I want to talk about the service industry stuff in a second, but one of the things I do think is interesting is because so much of it is about political climate, right?
Right.
So like when the auto workers had their strike recently and Biden actually went to the picket line and, but you saw this real interesting contrast in the politics of it because Trump also talked to a group of workers, although they were non-union workers, right? And so this idea of that where's the political support, right? And I think that yes, we're not going to be a mass industrial society again. That's there's a little bit of up and down in industrial production, right?
Yeah. But there's no going back.
It's not going to be the core of our economy anymore.
Right.
So, one thing that has to happen is the breaking of the idea that that's what a union worker looks like. Right. And I use that phrase looks like very specifically because I think the problem that the service industry organizing faces is that it is overwhelmingly female and non-white. Right. And like I said before, those groups have never been really seen in the United States politically as the true American worker, right? The true American worker from like back early 20th century on has been the brawny white male, working with his hands. That's the American worker. So one thing is there needs to be sort of a cultural change. Now, I think that to some extent that is happening demographically, right? That is happening demographically. I do think that unions need to do a lot more to propagandize that. that these are the true American. The true American worker is the Latina who's who's cleaning your hotel room.
Right.
Right.
Yeah.
She's the true American worker. And I do think demographic change will help with that, but it needs to be nudged along.
Right. Yes. Yeah.
Because, as we can see in our general politics, there's still a core of American society that believes that that a true American looks a certain way.
Right.
And, and that core is not going away anytime soon. So you do have to, I think, nudge along. You can't just wait for the demographic change to happen. You have to nudge it along with propaganda. And I think that so a lot of organizing among those groups, especially aimed at younger audiences, like the propaganda aimed at younger audiences. Because like I said a few minutes ago, I really think so much of the success of unions has been based on, well, obviously economically what's going on at the time. Right. We got the stuff we got because of the Great Depression and demand for labor in World War II, right? We lost a lot because of the industrialization, right? So yes, it does depend on what's going on economically, but it also depends on public opinion and the narrative that is out there about labor. And I think that it's going to be hard because there has been, 50 plus years of narrative that, blames labor, that others labor. So it's not going to happen overnight. But I do think that since there's not that much that unions themselves can do about the economic conditions, that it's a lot of it is about creating that, when there's public acceptance of the idea, things go better.
Right. Yes. Right? Yeah.
And I do think there's an opportunity here with sort of younger, like under 40 folk, let's say, who, there's a really strong sense. Well, you're probably in that age group, right?
Yes, I'm 24. Yeah. So I definitely, yeah.
So, there's a lot of anxiety in that age group about a cost of housing, about affordability of things. So I think that there may be more amenability to the message in the younger age groups that are really themselves facing these economic problems.
Yeah. Right? Yes. Yeah. I would say to touch on that, I think I can speak pretty anecdotally on this one. Yeah. No, I definitely think, especially just talking with people my age, we kind of, not only do we see some of the, the stuff we're facing of, just buying a house and not seeming tenable, but like also just the kind of the false bill of goods we were sold with, like the college deal of like, hey, go to college, you'll get a job, you'll be able to buy a house. And then we do that. And not only are we in debt, but then we can't do that as well. We can't buy a house or anything. So it's like, okay, so the system that was designed at a certain point that worked is not working anymore for us. And so I do think there is this broad-based, I don't think it is necessarily like a pro-union necessarily, but is, I think, anti-capitalist in a sense of just very being fed up. And again, reading throughout the kind of the 19th century labor history and then it kind of ending with the Gilded Age. And then after that, the progressive movement, obviously. I do see some hope in that because I do see where we're at now is this new Gilded Age in a sense of just of just overwhelming wealth for a very small few. And it's like, you see people using that to go to space and do, or there's a new story of somebody's building a replica of the Titanic. And it's like, why? Like an exact replica. And it's like, okay, I would love to have a house.
It didn't work out so well.
No, exactly. That's it is insane. It's insane. But again, I think seeing all of this, and it's so blatant that it does give rise to a certain feeling among my generation, and then definitely like the millennials who went through like Occupy Wall Street and that whole movement. I definitely think that has given us a shared kind of feeling of like, hey, we kind of got screwed a little bit, and we need something to help push the envelope and go, hey, we need our deal reassessed and we need a better deal, or again, a new deal. And it's very funny thinking of it in that sense of like that we've been here before. We're just here again. It's unfortunate, but I do see some hope in that because the general feeling among me and all my friends and anybody in a similar position as me is that very unhappy, not necessarily knowing where to put that energy, but at the same time still having that energy somewhere. So
And so it may be a more openness to like that kind of message.
Yes, I do think, and this is one of the reasons why I'm trying to do this and kind of put something together to show people like, hey, what we have right now, all the benefits, even as, as not great as they are, because obviously 8-hour week is way better than 10 or 12-hour week, but again, it's not great for certain jobs and whatnot. So I do think going, hey, we can change this. Like, people have changed it in the past. We can change it now. We just have to remember not only that past, but also how they accomplished that. So with that, yeah. Oh no, yes, please go ahead.
Well, and I think that there's also more openness to, and I guess this big barrier that I see of the way that certain people are not considered real workers. I think that the younger generations have less of that. Right.
Yes, it's like, for example, like I am a salary worker or whatnot, but it's like I don't see myself in any different position than, I have multiple friends who are servers or whatnot in the serving industry. And it's just like, I know it wasn't necessarily because of like my skill or anything. It's more of just like somewhat the life position I was put in and the way I got here. It's, again, if I was in their shoes, I would be them. Like, I would be in the same exact position as them. So I think a lot of people, especially my age, and again, I think it's that rotten deal you get even in the salaried positions of like, oh, you don't get pension, you don't get better benefits then. And so it's like, well, what is the difference then? Like, there's this shrinking difference between me and a server. Again, there's still a difference, obviously, but it is shrinking. And it's like, okay, well, I can see that continuing every day. I mean, there's some bill proposed where it's trying to cut down on like lunch, like being able to just take a lunch break. It's no, you can't do that anymore. It's like, okay. Yeah. So I see this being eroded in front of my eyes. So now I'm going to try to.
But this is the sort of political environment is one thing, but also who's in office is the other thing. So it's like, I mean, really, I think the CIO was right. It turns out politics is so important, right?
Yes.
And like, it's, and one of the things is it depends on what state you're in, right? Which, what the labor environment is. And some states are getting so bad, including our own.
Yes. Yeah. When I really,
you're still in Kentucky, right?
Oh, I'm in Kentucky. Yeah. And when I learned it was only in like high school when I started really working was when I learned like what right to work was. And even then it took me a little bit longer to realize because I didn't realize why unions were so beneficial. And it was like, oh, okay, this is not good. But it is just one of those things that you don't really learn about any of this stuff in like high school or whatnot, which is, I mean, I have a cynical reasoning about that of like, why would you, because it's not beneficial to most the people at the top. But it's still, you do learn about it, whether or not you really want to. It's just how much you do. But yes, no, I do see a future. And again, with like multiple people, I've had multiple friends who are serving in, not huge, chains or anything, but still talking about unionization and bringing like a union consultant to see if it's feasible within their, workplace. So I do see some future with that. And I do think that my generation and the millennials as well above us are very receptive to it because we've also have not the best deal in the world for us. And then also haven't had like the propaganda of, that demonization of unions or whatnot, or at least just like boogeymanning of them. So I think we're far more open for that than previous generations. So
and they got to vote.
Yes, and they got, and that's the other thing is the well, and that's what's so interesting too is
gotta vote.
One of the biggest things is the laws and the people in power who have changed how unions, like I forget where, I think it was Colorado, a strike in Colorado in the 1880s, I believe. And the governor at the time, working class governor, like the unions had pushed for him. And then when that dispute came, when, a basically private army was raised up to crush them, the governor went, no, actually, and settled the deal between them. It was like one of the first examples of that, but there are many, many examples afterwards of, hey, who you vote for actually matters. And it meant, going back to Taft-Hartley, if the composition of the Senate or the House was different, that could have gone completely differently. So, it absolutely matters who you vote for. Do I wish there were better options? Yes, I think everyone does, but it still in the end does matter. And if you have the ability, especially depending on what state you are, if you have the ability to really make your vote count, then it's like you please do. I think that's a good way to end it as well. So Tracy, thank you so much for joining me.
This is really interesting.
I'm really glad this is given me plenty of books to read about the
Yeah,
subject, but then also just a lot of great information. So I really appreciate you hopping on.
sure thing. Let me know if
And
you need anything else.
yeah, absolutely, absolutely. You have a wonderful rest of your day.
Thanks. You too.
All right, see you, Tracy.
Bye bye.
So that was the conversation between me and Tracy K'Meyer of U of L's history department, talking about 20th century labor history in America. I just want to extend a big thank you again to Tracy for talking with me about this, what I consider a very important topic. And I hope to have many conversations in the future with not only her, but other either labor historians, labor leaders, union members, so on and so forth. So if you are one of those people and you would be interested in talking about this, please feel free to message me, get in touch, comment on this, and yeah, absolutely, we can set up something to talk about labor in America. I think it's a great conversation no matter what you're talking about. So again, thank you, Tracy. If you want to check out any more of her stuff, the link is in description to her U of L bio page. So it has more about her and some of her books as well. I highly recommend you go check those out. And just again, thank you for watching. Really appreciate it. If you want to subscribe to the channel, if you want more of this, please do. And like it, definitely helps. But yeah, thank you just so much for watching. I really appreciate it. And I will hopefully see you soon. Thanks.